The next thing that I'd like for us to talk about, why should you plan these things ahead of time? 3 big reasons. The first one, having a list to follow will help you be consistent, no matter the student. Having that list and knowing that if something happens, there is a plan for what I will do, especially your first few years, will give you confidence. That consistency from student to student will also give you confidence. And finally, it's just clear communication. It's the backbone of your expectations. Students already understand what the consequences are. They can see them because they're posted in the room or they're on a handout that you've given them. I always posted them in the room. You can send that home to parents so they already understand, what are the expectations, what are the consequences, and there's clear communication from the get-go. These are the consequences that I used for nearly every year that I taught middle school. The only difference is the first year that I taught, on top of number 1, the original number 1 was a warning. Then number 2 was the conference. Number 3 was noon detention, and so forth. And I ended up taking the warning out because I typically gave warnings verbally, and I didn't want to have to stop and write down I gave the student a warning. So I took that away, giving myself the flexibility to maybe give another warning if I felt like the student would not take advantage of that and it wasn't in the list. So the very first thing that happened was a conference. That just meant I taught to you before class, during class, or after class, one-on-one, and I made sure that you were clearly aware that what you were choosing to do was a problem and that you should stop. And if you did not, then you would get noon detention. Now, here's how I did noon detention. The first time I gave, or the first few times I gave a student noon detention, I sent them to the school's noon detention because we had one that operated and you could send a student to noon detention. It was in the cafeteria, and the cafeteria is a busy place, and the teacher and the administrator that were on duty there had plenty to worry about other than watching the noon detention students. So when I observed what was happening, I just thought, I don't think that that's got any kind of, that's not uncomfortable, to use the Barbara Coloroso wording, because students looked pretty happy sitting there in noon detention, eating their lunch. It just seemed like they were at lunch, but having to sit at a specific table. So I started bringing students to my own classroom for noon detention. Our lunch was 30 minutes. And at first I tried having them go get their lunch or go eat their lunch and then come to my classroom. That did not work because they would always have a reason why they hadn't arrived on time. So then I had students come to my classroom and have their detention there before going to lunch, and that worked much better. All I had to do was make sure that I didn't keep anybody in my classroom long enough that they couldn't get a tray from the cafeteria if that's what they wanted. So typically noon detention lasted about 12 minutes, which doesn't sound like a lot maybe to an adult brain, but to a middle school brain, and that's my only 30 minutes of downtime and social time, and the best stuff happens in the cafeteria in the first 15 minutes, and I'm missing out on that, and I'm the last one eating, or I'm sitting there by myself. It worked in the middle school situation I was in. So they would come to my class, report for noon detention, and then they would go when their time was done. My next step, and probably the most powerful, is contacting the family. You might wonder, why didn't you do that first? Because I had middle school kids and I was trying to get them to take responsibility for their own behavior before I had to get their families involved. I wasn't trying to leave the families out, and I would bring the family in as needed. But if we got to this point, I wanted to be able to say, here's what's happened so far. I've warned her. I've spoken with her. I brought her in for part of her lunch and we talked in detail about how to fix this. It's still a problem. So I'm calling to talk to you about it. And then finally, an office referral, which I tried to avoid. If you've read some of the articles, you know that this transfers power to some other person away from you. So I tried to save this for big stuff. You hit someone in my classroom, you're going to the office. You screamed curse words at me or others, you're going to the office because you just put on a big show. And kids need to see you go to the office for that sort of thing. Just a warning for saying the F word in class when you're 12, to me, that's not a logical consequence. Kids need to see that's a pretty big deal. So I would use the office. Rarely was my goal. Here's what I used in my classroom when students came to detention. And I don't remember where I got this, and it's not exactly from the original. So I apologize if you recognize this from some other source and you think I've plagiarized it. I have not. I just can't figure out where I got it long ago. But when students came into my classroom and sat down for noon detention, I'd put one of these in front of them on a piece of paper, and they would write about what happened, why they chose the behavior, what rule applies to the situation, and what consequence they think is appropriate, and what will you do the next time this situation comes around. So I would always have one of these on a desk with a pencil, and when they would come in, I would say, just have a seat, fill that out. When you're finished, let me know. So the student would sit down, fill out this paper, they'd let me know when they were finished, and then I'd come over and sit across from them, and we would talk about their answers. And it was a chance sometimes for me to get to know a student a little bit better. Students are very different when it's just you and the student, or it's a small group versus a large group. Sometimes for number 2, I would find out there were things in the room that were leading to this behavior that we could fix. I've had students say, well, Sheila's my best friend, so if you could move me away from her, I'll be much better behaved, because we just get into trouble. I didn't know this. Thank you for telling me. We can make that happen, and we can help solve the situation. Back in the day, before as everybody carried a phone around, I was doing these hard copies. But now, if I were to do this again, and I would use a Google form so that I could fill this out in a discipline situation without having to have the student do the noon detention, or if you came in for noon detention, instead of a piece of paper and a pencil, I'd have an iPad there, and you would fill this out, and it would flow to a spreadsheet so that I could keep track of every student who came in and when they came in and what was the result. I didn't make this. A former student of mine who's now teaching made this and told me about it, and I asked her if she would share it with us. So you can see that she had the student fill in the last name, first name, and period. There was a list of reasons. Then there was another list. This is in case there's multiple things that happen. So if it was both this and that, we would check them both. Explanation and action, submit. And then if you don't know about Google Forms, you should really look them up and research them online. Kids fill this out. When they press submit, all of their answers flow to a Google Sheet, like an Excel spreadsheet. And if you have them put in their last name separately from their first name, you can alphabetize that spreadsheet by the student's last name. You could even alphabetize based on the situation to see what situation am I encountering the most with my students. So a really powerful way to integrate some technology into the way that you manage your students, all based on a behavior agreement. Oh, and by the way, don't call these contracts, because mine used to be called a behavior contract. I sent one of these home to be signed by a parent. I got an angry phone call saying that I would hear from the parent's lawyer because I was trying to get a minor to sign a binding contract, which was illegal, and I was going to lose my job. And so I just apologized and changed the name to agreement. Incentives, our last topic. I think we can knock this one out in the last few minutes that we've got on this video. Having an incentive system is a great, it's kind of like frosting on the classroom management cake. Everybody loves a little frosting, and kids love incentives. So you build in, these are just some basics that everyone can and should be doing. A positive note to a student who makes progress, or to encourage the student. Just something small that you privately hand to the student and just say, hey, you're doing a great job. I've noticed your effort. You've really made improvements. You could do a positive parent contact, especially if you've already called for a negative reason. Following up to say, wow, things are so much better. That's important. I do this. Sometimes I call parents to the school bus. I'll have to say, here's what's going on. Please speak to your child. And then I try to, when I see them, even if they're just standing on their porch, they'll look at me, and it's like this knowing look of, well, and I'll just give them a thumbs up. Things are so much better. A little award or recognition. If you do awards for your classroom at the end of the 9 weeks, end of the semester, end of year, have a variety of awards of all sorts. They're not just academic. They could be about citizenship. They could be about being helpful. They could be about answering questions and having the most energy. Try to spread awards and recognition all around, because often it's the same kids that get the straight A, perfect attendance sort of thing. So try to bring everybody in. These can be individual, small group or whole class. Do think about intrinsic rewards and incentives versus extrinsic. If you're not sure what these mean, extrinsic, that's like, oh, you gave me candy because I did my homework. Intrinsic, well, you gave me a note that told me that you appreciated my effort. Extrinsic are outside, intrinsic more inside. They work on what I believe about myself and help me to see my strengths. All the research says that intrinsic incentives are more powerful than extrinsic, but I also live in the real world, and sometimes kids love a prize, so I think you balance these. Special privileges in your classroom, getting to use this, sit here, do that, extra time here or there, those can be individual, group, or whole class also. Here's how I do incentives on my school bus. This is a picture from the inside of my school bus, and my little kids, these are all K4 kids. They all have assigned seats. School buses are magnetic on top, so that's just a little piece of cardstock I laminated and threw some magnets on the back of, so everyone knows where they sit. And I usually do an incentive program like a Rider of the Week, where I'm watching for kids that are super well behaved. I used to make little posters like this, laminate them, put magnets on them, and stick them on the bus for the week. So these are the kids that were Riders of the Week. They also got a little piece, they got Skittles, because Skittles are typically safe for all allergies. Don't quote me on that, I'm just saying that's my experience. And then I would send home a little note with each of them saying, your child is Rider of the Week. Riders of the Week, they get to sit where they want. So that was the real thing they were after, is they were allowed to sit in other seats than their own assigned seat. And as long as they were well behaved, they didn't have to ask if they could do that. They could just move themselves. Because typically the procedure is, you're in that seat unless you ask me. And I usually say no. When people say, can I sit with so-and-so? On Fridays, I tend to say yes. But K4 kids, I'm not sure they're seeing that pattern just yet. But they'll figure it out eventually. Here's what the little note looked like that I sent home with students. I would sign my name, write this child's name there, put a sticker on it. When I taught school, I had an incentive called Silent Ball that I learned from my wife, who used to play this with her elementary school teacher when she was in elementary school in California. It's super simple. Put desks in a circle, get a little soft kind of ball like the kinds that are in the netting in the Walmart toy aisle, something someone could get hit with and it wouldn't hurt them. And kids just pass a ball back and forth. You have some rules about what, when are you out, when are you in. If you miss the ball, you're out. If you overthrow the ball, you're out. And then the key point, if you speak, you're out. So it's a very quiet game. The reason it's a silent game is because to play this with teachers teaching on both sides of you with thin classroom walls, you can't be playing a ruckus game without making people mad. And so it was silent for the most part. Now, people talked in between rounds, and when something funny happened, we laughed, but generally it was very quiet. And most of the time when kids got out for talking, it was because they would try to argue with me. I was the referee, and I'd be like, you're out. No, you're out, and you talked. You're out. So this worked well for middle school. Kids would work really hard for it. I had one of these drawn on my whiteboard. It had about 80 marks on it. Each class had their own marker. And if you follow the expectations that I've set out as a class, and everyone's working hard, and we don't have behavior issues, then the class moved up about 5 notches a day. So with 80 notches, you can imagine it took quite a few school days to get themselves to the top. So it was a big deal when they earned this. It was a non-academic game. We didn't do any instruction that day. We just played silent ball and had a good time. I had a teacher once say, isn't that a waste of academic time? So I wrote up a little proposal and sent it to my principal and said, hey, here's what I'm doing. They're working hard for 3.5 to 4 weeks, and I'm giving them 1 day to play. And he said, do it. I approve this. And that way I had a little backup in case any hater teachers came along that wanted to shut down the silent ball action we were having in my classroom. So I think you should think about what incentives could be appropriate and effective for your students, whether elementary, middle school, or secondary. You can do research online to come up with ideas. You can talk to other teachers to find out what they do. Sometimes your school has an incentive program that everyone follows. So these can be pretty powerful and can give your students reasons to want to follow your expectations. And it's a great way to reward students for their good behavior. That's the end.